Let me show you a little bit of what Babbitt does with hexachords. Babbitt not only can manipulate 12 pitches of the chromatic scale into tone rows, but he's also quite interested in manipulating just 6 pitches, choosing 6 pitches as a set. 6 pitches would be a hexachord, a 6-note set. Here is the 6th pitch, the hexachord, from the Babbitt's 3 compositions for piano, first movement. This is the first 6 pitches that are in the left hand of the piano, and I know that they're a set because he ends with a tied note value, and that is actually signaling the end of a grouping. So in this case, I know D flat is the end of a grouping there. This is half the chromatic scale. The content of this hexachord, one way to look at hexachords is to look at what intervals you can get by throwing just these notes together. We see that this hexachord has a nice perfect fourth in it. It's got a major second, another major second. There's a whole way to catalog what intervals can be generated by jumbling together the notes of this hexachord. This hexachord, being 6 pitches, is half of the chromatic scale. The other half of the chromatic scale is called the complement. These 2 sets, these 2 hexachords, are complements of each other. Together, they add up to the aggregate, that is, the entire chromatic scale. 6 pitches, 6 pitches. Oops, don't look at that one. There we go, 6 pitches. In the beginning of this movement, the first movement of the 3 compositions, he allows us to see the first hexachord, the original hexachord, and he also gives us the complement. In the second measure of the piece, the left hand has the complement, but it's presented in retrograde, so that it goes in this order. And the right hand is presenting the complement of itself back to the original set. It's giving us the same pitches again, but again in retrograde. So he is taking a set of 6 pitches and its complement, the other 6 pitches, and he's playing with which way do we read it? Do we read it from B flat all the way through E flat F D? Or do we read it from D flat, C, D, F? He's playing with the order, and he's playing with the aggregate and the complement. Another aspect of hexachord theory that Babbitt likes to mess with, and he does so to a certain extent in the 3 compositions, is called combinatoriality. It's a way of manipulating the 6 pitches of your hexachord to get 6 other pitches. And the way you get those pitches is determined by mathematics or interval relationships. So instead of choosing after your initial row or your initial hexachord, instead of choosing your next 6 pitches or the next transposition or inversion based on how you feel, you rely instead on the beauty of math, the beauty of numbers. I'm using a simpler set here because you can see it in the handout. Hear, play, and note the sound. Babbitt was commissioned to write a piece for children to be included in the Silver Burdett General Music 5th grade music book that would show them this modern style of composition. It was deemed to be important to show kids in their general music class in 5th grade what this new post-tonal sound was like. So Babbitt composed a piece for singing and bells, and it uses the hexachord. Do, mi, fa, re, sol, la. This hexachord is the pitches, the first pitches of the major scale. If you sing it C, D, E, F, G, A, there's 6 pitches. There's something special about the content of this hexachord, because if you transpose it correctly, for example, up 6 half steps, you don't just get any old 6 pitches, like whatever they are, I don't care. You actually get the other unused 6 pitches of the chromatic scale. You get the complement. So it maps onto its complement at T6. That's pretty cool. However, if you transpose this set correctly, I think it's, I can't remember which transposition it is. If you transpose it and invert it correctly, you will actually get the set itself inverted. You will get A, G, D, F, E, C. That's actually a big deal. You might not think, well, that seems easy. Well, think about it. If I transpose this set up a half step, I would get C sharp, F, F sharp, E, G sharp, E flat, G sharp, B flat. Some of the pitches that I get, like here, I would get the F again. If I transpose this pitch up a half step, it becomes an F. E up a half step is F. So you say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, it's got parts of the set I already used, this original set, and it would have some pitches that came from the complement. There's nothing special about it. There's nothing to set it aside. But now, because we've thrown out key signatures, we've thrown out relationships like closely related keys, we need something else that makes a set special to other sets. And so this hexachord is special to its complement, which I can generate by transposing and inverting the right distance. And this set is actually complementary to itself under the right conditions. I can invert and transpose it, and I get the same pitches again, just in a different order. For example, there. This order of pitches, we actually see it in the song, Hear, Play, and Note the Sound. The pitches recombine themselves by a mathematical process, not by the emotional choices of the flawed human being. Here's one more demonstration of combinatoriality, the combinatorial property of hexachords. It really would be easier just to give you a complete and self-sufficient theory lecture, but I'm doing this just so you can get a sense of how much the Second Viennese School composers, especially the High Modernists like Babbitt, really relied on the beauty and the architecture of numbers rather than the beauty of emotion or the architecture of narrative, which we have thrown out. Here's another all combinatorial hexachord. That is, if I transpose this hexachord correctly, and by the way, it's 012678 for those who are into such things. If I transpose this hexachord correctly, I would get the same hexachord again. For example, I'll transpose it up 6 half steps. C transposes to F sharp. This transposes to G, G sharp. F sharp up 6 half steps is a C. Up 6 half steps here is a C sharp and a D. So if I transpose this hexachord up 6 half steps, hey presto, this is what happens. It's the same pitches, just in a different order. That's pretty amazing. If I take the original hexachord that I started with, there it is, and I invert it, if I invert it by going down a half step and down a half step and down a major third, instead of going up, 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 and if I choose the correct transposition of that inversion, I would end up with this. G sharp, I had to write F double sharp because I ran out of blocks. It could be G. F sharp, D, D flat, I could have written C sharp, it doesn't matter, C. I've actually ended up with the same hexachord again. The pitches vertically here are the same as the horizontal pitches here. I've gotten the same answer by choosing a mathematically determined interval of inversion and transposition. It's not just choosing any old 6 pitches that please me. This kind of highly determined structure is how Babbitt and other composers in the Second Viennese School can add order to a seemingly chaotic landscape where all 12 pitches are apparently equal. So I described a little bit of how Babbitt constructs his initial tone row. I used it both in our row, in the example of here's how a tone row is generated, and here's how a hexachord can go through permutations. And Babbitt uses it to order and construct this whole piece. If you look at the handouts that I'm including in the little packet of things for these video lectures, you will see that Babbitt not only chooses the notes of the row, he leaves them in order, as we would expect, they're serialized, but even when he's creating things like chords, the way in which you read a chord, do you read it from the bottom note up, like we would a root position triad? He says, well, you could, or you could read it from the top down. Who says that the bottom of the chord, the root, is always the most important thing? He says, I also create triads from the top down. And so some of his triads go in the order of the hexachord from the bottom up, and then the next one goes from the top down, and then the bottom up and the top down. So for example, when we get to the triad bit in measure 10, the way you're supposed to read those trichords, if you think of them from the bottom, going up or from the top down, he actually takes the idea of up, down, and serializes that. So he's got 4 trichords, up, down, and then he says, okay, up, up, down, 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 up, down, up. He mixes those 4, the 2 ups and the 2 downs, he mixes them up in a sort of planned serialization. The way in which the pitches are grouped in the tone row is also serialized. And each little grouping, as I mentioned briefly, is signaled by a tied over note, a longer note in the beginning than a 16th note. So if you go in measure 1 and you look at the left hand, you'll see 6 notes that end with a tied over note, 6/16. And then there's a grouping of 4 notes. Well, sorry, let me start again. There's a grouping of 5 notes plus 1 by itself. 5 plus 1 is 6. Then there's a grouping of 4 notes plus 2. 4 plus 2 is 6. 5, 1, 4, 6. You've just gotten through the tone row, and you've also not just given those pitches in their order, but you've grouped them in an order that is itself transposable. So now I could go 4, 2, 5, 1. I could go, if I originally went 5, 1, 4, 2, I could go 2, 4, 1, 5. Everything is serialized, but what do we hear? This piece goes by so fast. This is a piano piece. There is no key signature. You have to read every accidental. You can't just rely on tonal memory or rondo form to get you through this thing. This piece is an incredible achievement to play. What do we hear? We don't hear this hidden structure. I just spent 15 minutes of video lecture talking about the first 12 bars of this piece, and I didn't even finish. I haven't even talked about the dynamics and how they're serialized because I haven't figured it out yet. The piece goes by so fast that you don't hear this structure. What do we hear on the surface? We hear a sort of expressive, timbral palette. It's not impressionist, but it's vague. We hear things popping out of the texture and gestures and sort of colors, but we don't hear all of this hidden structure. That's what makes it high modernist. The structure, it is super structured, but we don't hear it on the outside. It's okay that we don't. Interestingly, Babbitt said about one of his other pieces, the one that's in your anthology, actually, the pieces for 4 instruments. He got frustrated with people who were trying to analyze that composition for 4 instruments and trying to find the tone row, and the tone row doesn't appear at the beginning and it's hidden in there. He gets frustrated and says, oh, this piece isn't about cryptoanalysis. You're not supposed to sit there and pick it apart, idiots. He doesn't say idiots, but I think he meant it. But it's kind of funny because that is a huge aspect for many of the enjoyment of this piece. You're invited to get in there and poke around and marvel at its architectural beauty if you're one of the elitist group. But I think he's also frustrated because he actually does sort of betray a wish to have people listen and say, ah, yes, structure, calm, beauty that is somehow there. He sort of wants his cake but doesn't want to share it with anyone, and he wants them to enjoy it as well, if I can just mix that metaphor up completely. I will say Babbitt also years later writes an article called We Do Care, something like We Do Care If You Listen. So there is a shift away from this sort of locked in a tower view of what music should sound like. But it's interesting that this kind of high modernist formalism exists. Here are some style characteristics for Babbitt, and then I have a little snippet of a story to tell you that will take 30 seconds. Babbitt, style characteristic 1, absence of emotional expression by the performer. Absence of emotional expression by the performer. Notice I'm not saying that Babbitt didn't intend for some emotion to be there that he put in it. I don't know that I know what that is, but it's there, I guess, maybe. Second style characteristic, mathematical permutations as the controlling idea. Mathematical permutations as the controlling idea. That is, things must be math-based. The tone row itself maps onto its two hexachords, the hexachord and its complement. They map onto themselves. The order of pitches is mathematically beautiful. Third style characteristic, similar to Webern, every musical element is controlled. Every musical element is controlled. My little closing story about High Modernism. Years ago, the Columbus Brass was a brass trio. It was horn, trumpet, and trombone. And we were reading through pieces to find more works to play in the limited brass trio repertoire. And we had a lot of pieces that are actually in the Schwab Library from the 50s and 60s, because everybody who was now a PhD student in composition was composing in serial style, and they often would compose for brass trio, because why not? So we pulled out a piece, and it was for horn, trumpet, and trombone. The trumpet part did not say trumpet in C or trumpet in B flat, and we looked in the score, and it was not clear whether the horn was in F, and the trombone was in bass clef concert pitch, but the trumpet part was still unlabeled. And we thought, well, somebody just made a mistake. It was a handwritten score. So we played it through, and the trumpet teacher at the time, Dr. Rulli, played it on his C trumpet, because we thought that's probably what it was. And we thought, well, I'm not sure. We looked at each other, and he said, hang on, let's do it again. Pulled out his B flat trumpet, and we played it. And we thought, clearly, there's going to be one of these two transpositions. Essentially, he transposed the trumpet part by playing it on a different trumpet. One of these is going to speak to us and clearly say, this is the one. You're going to hear something is going to come together, and we're going to say, oh, of course, it's a B flat trumpet. Played it through, and we looked at each other and said, I don't think it makes a difference. The rows were all perfectly preserved, and without really in-depth analysis of the verticalities and how they intersected, there was no way for us, the performers, to decide which transposition of the trumpet line we should use. We would have had to go and put it in a matrix and figure out all the hidden structure just to decide, and maybe be correct, which was the correct version of the trumpet part. We did not put that piece in our repertoire because we didn't feel like matrixing it. Anyway, I think that's kind of an amusing little story. And so I think we'll end there.